Hello and welcome to another installment of the Cato Institute sponsor e-briefing series. My name is Caleb Brown. I'm the Director of Multimedia here at the Cato Institute. Before we get to our main event, a few updates on some pieces we have released recently. Infrastructure Investment, a State, Local, and Private Responsibility by Chris Edwards. China, America, and the Pivot to Asia by Justin Logan. A Rational Response to the Privacy Crisis by Larry Downs. Should U.S. fiscal policy address slow growth or debt? A non-dilemma by Cato Senior Fellow Jeffrey Myron. And a new policy analysis, Humanity Unbound, How Fossil Fuels Saved Humanity and Nature, from Nature and Nature from Humanity by Inder Goklani. We're hosting a Cato Institute City seminar in Naples, Florida, coming up on January 30th. At the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Naples. Speakers include Cato President John Allison, Charles Murray of the American Enterprise Institute, and humorist P.J. O'Rourke. Cato's 25th Annual Benefactors Summit is an annual retreat for sponsors who give a gift of $5,000 or more per year. It'll be held at the Four Seasons Resort in Scottsdale, Arizona from February 21st through the 24th. Aside from numerous Cato scholars, speakers include Tucker Carlson, Nobel laureate in economics Vernon Smith, and Senator Jeff Flake. You can contact Joe Kuhn for details. His email address should be at the bottom of this page. Here is how e-briefings work. We are hosting our briefing today in the Roger and Elizabeth Hagens Multimedia Center. This facility provides a dedicated space for this kind of discussion. Will also serve as a broadcast platform for the broadcast of our scholars' views across the globe. These briefings are meant to give our supporters exclusive access to our scholars to discuss issues of the day. If you have any questions or feedback or thoughts about how we conduct these events, please email me directly, Caleb Brown, cbrown@cato.org, or Joe Kuhn. Again, his email address should be at the bottom of this page. And these briefings are largely driven by your questions, so to the extent that you have one in the chat room, please go ahead and type it in at any time during this event. We can't get to all of them, but we'll do our level best to get to as many questions as possible. To our speaker today, under the direction of Tim Lynch, the Cato Institute's Project on Criminal Justice has become a leading voice in support of civil liberties and the Bill of Rights. His research interests include the war on terrorism, overcriminalization, the drug war, militarization of police, and gun control. In 2000, he served on the National Committee to Prevent Wrongful Executions. He also filed several amicus briefs in the United States Supreme Court for cases involving constitutional rights. He is the editor of In the Name of Justice. Leading experts re-examine the classic article, The Aim of the Criminal Law, and After Prohibition, An Adult Approach to Drug Policies in the 21st Century. These books available at cato.org. Tim is a member of the Wisconsin, D.C., and Supreme Court bars. He earned both a BS and JD from Marquette University. And in addition to writing and blogging at the Cato Institute website, he also blogs extensively at the Cato Institute's National Police Misconduct Reporting Project. We'll get a few comments from Tim, and then we'll go straight to your questions. So in the chat room, go ahead and begin typing those in now. Tim?
Thanks, Caleb. It's great to be with you. I thought I'd just make a few points to get us started. First of all, when we're talking about gun control, I think when you boil down all the arguments on both sides, we're talking about the individual's right to self-defense, one of our most basic rights. You went through some of our recent Cato publications. We publish dozens of articles, studies, and books every year. To me, the common thread that runs through all of that work is that we're trying to give people more control over their own lives. You get to decide where your kids go to school. You get to decide where your savings go into what retirement plan. You get to decide which doctor you want to see. When we're talking about the right to keep and bear arms, we're talking about the ability of people to enhance their own safety, going back to that basic right of individual self-defense. The politicians want people to believe that they can deliver safety to the community, but the police, as hard as they will, they can't be there for everybody. They're not our personal bodyguards, and their reaction times are often too slow. They're not there when you actually need them. They're not our bodyguards. And the criminals, you have to remember, always have the advantage because they choose the time and the place when they're going to strike. So a lot of us want to take responsibility for our own safety. That's what this comes down to. Who's responsible for your safety, you or somebody else? So for those of people who want to take responsibility for their own safety, they want to have guns in order to protect themselves from a criminal attack. And the second point I want to make, and this is something you don't hear from President Obama or from a lot of the people talking on TV about these gun control proposals, is that every day Americans are using guns to protect themselves and to save lives. It's easy for the president and for members of the media to point out the number of people who are killed by criminal misuse of guns. We're bombarded with these stories on the evening news every night about people getting shot, people getting mugged, and people getting killed. What you don't hear about are the number of people that their lives are saved because they were able to use guns in self-defense. And there's a couple of reasons we don't hear about that. The number one reason is that in most of the cases, the gun is never discharged. All it takes is a person to brandish a gun, and the criminal is running in the opposite direction. So the crime has been thwarted. And from the standpoint of your local news producer, he's going to ask his reporters, okay, we don't have a suspect in custody, we don't have anybody injured, and no crime was committed. They don't report that on the news. So we don't hear about all those stories. There was a story, though, in the Washington Post yesterday that I did a blog post about. There was a 10-year-old boy here in the district riding his new bicycle that he got for Christmas, riding it around the neighborhood. When he turned a corner, he suddenly came upon 3 unattended pit bulls who proceeded to maul him. A neighbor saw what was going on, ran into his house, got his handgun, came out, and shot one of the pit bulls to stop the attack. Now, is this neighbor, is he on the front page of the newspaper being hailed as a hero, saving the life of the 10-year-old boy? No. He actually needs a lawyer because the police say he's under investigation because he may have discharged his weapon outside of the property line. So this is in the Metro section of the newspaper. A man used a gun to save a life, and he's not being hailed as a hero. He actually needs a lawyer because he's caught up in the web of these DC gun laws. One third point before we turn to some of the questions is that we have to break down this big subject of gun control into a couple of separate categories because they're all getting mixed up by the politicians. Number one is if we're talking about school shootings like the big incident obviously in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, if the question is, how can we make our schools safe, how can we protect children? There's the other issue of gun control generally and the number of homicides in the United States, people killed by guns. That's another category. So we have to separate these things out when we talk about what are the most sensible proposals in order to address some of these problems.
All right, we have several questions already. I'm going to use my privilege to ask the first one here. There seems to be a real disconnect between the types of legislation that are being proposed by the president and members of Congress and the types of guns that they're going after and the types of guns that are used in crimes.
That's right. I mean, again, if we're talking about, see, these terms are thrown around very casually and we have to break them down, whether we're talking about school shootings, whether we're talking about homicides, or whether we're talking about gun violence or deaths by guns. All of these things have to be broken down because if you're talking about, sometimes a number is thrown around like 30,000 people a year die by gun violence or gun deaths. Well, of the 30,000, about 18,000 of those people are suicides. Okay? So it's a striking number. I didn't know the number was so high until you get into these numbers. But so you have to put aside, if we're talking about, what policies make sense towards addressing some of these problems, you have to break these down. Now you mentioned like the homicides. Overwhelmingly in the United States, homicides are committed with handguns, which are not being even discussed right now. I mean, in the previous years, the people in the gun control movement wanted to ban handguns. So we did see proposals like that years ago, but after the landmark Heller decision in the Supreme Court saying that people have a right to keep a handgun in the home for purposes of self-defense, that more drastic proposal now is really off the table. But it goes right to your point. If we're talking about rifles, is this really going to address the problem of all the homicides that we hear about week in and week out? And it's not going to have any effect on that.
And of course, the Heller decision, Dick Heller, a friend of the Cato Institute, the case was funded by our chairman, Bob Levy, and worked on by Clark Neely at the Institute for Justice, and of course argued before the Supreme Court by Alan Gura. So we'll go to some questions here. Greg asks, are there any studies that support gun control with respect to lowering violent crime?
Actually, the National Academy of Sciences did a comprehensive study in 2004 looking through all of the literature, looking at a variety of gun control proposals that you hear about on the news about waiting periods, background checks, these types of things. And they concluded that there was really no strong evidence to support a connection between these gun control regulations and reducing violent crime. The thing we have to remember about when we're talking about gun regulations is they may sound good and their purpose may be good, but we have to always distinguish between the purpose of a bill that's being proposed and what its actual impact is going to be. Politicians don't normally ask those types of questions. They pass laws with nice-sounding names like the Violence Against Women Act, the Gun-Free School Zones Act. But are these laws going to have any impact on people's behavior? What happens is that these laws tend to affect the behavior of people who care about rules. Your ordinary gun owner cares about being in compliance with the law. But is it going to alter the impact of criminals or some of these suicidal killers who really, they couldn't care less what the laws are? So that's the key thing we have to look at, whether or not a gun control proposal is going to really have any actual impact on the problem that we're all trying to get at.
All right. Bob Howard asks, does your defense of gun rights go beyond that aspect of personal defense to include the ability to oppose tyrannical government? And if so, how do you frame it so that it seems logical and just?
Well, we know from the writings of the founders and the history of the Second Amendment that this is definitely a part of why the Second Amendment was put into the Constitution. We had our founding generation had just fought the Revolutionary War against the British. They broke from Britain because they thought the policies of England were getting oppressive, and they wanted to retain, if you read the Declaration of Independence, they wanted to be able to retain the power to alter or abolish a government that became oppressive. That's why they put the Second Amendment in there. That's not the only purpose of the Second Amendment. The right to keep and bear arms also applies to our individual right of self-defense. So there's several purposes to the amendment, and right now the focus is on the right of self-defense because we're trying to get at these crimes that are in the news, and that's what the politicians are focusing on.
Okay, Bob, a different Bob, asks, would you agree that the biggest single step we could do to alleviate gun violence would be to legalize drugs?
Yes, again, if we're putting aside the problem of school shootings and we want to get at the number of people who are killed by guns, and a lot of people are asking why the United States, we do have an extraordinarily high number of homicides in the United States than other countries. One of the reasons why we have such high numbers is because of our drug war. We have these gangs that are constantly warring with one another to get control over lucrative sales territory. It's happened in our major cities all around the country, these gang wars. So that's where a lot of this violence is coming from. And if we wanted to reduce those numbers, that's one of the best things that we could do. And are the politicians talking about it here in Washington? No, because we're talking about the government doing less. We could reduce a lot of this violence if they would repeal laws, repeal the laws against drug prohibition. After we moved away from alcohol prohibition, the violent crime rates in this country declined for 10 to 15 years, each year consecutively. We would see the same thing happen here in the United States. And also when we're talking about, so we've heard a lot about these international comparisons in this gun control debate. Look at Mexico. They have very strict rules. The ordinary person can't keep guns in Mexico. Look at their violent crime rate. Extraordinary numbers of people getting killed, and it's because of this black market violence involving drugs. So that's definitely something we are trying to put attention on.
Dean asks, what can be done to rein in the president's use or abuse of executive order? Of course, the president has a history of dropping bombs without Congress's permission for months on end. And here in the case of, he's issued 23 executive orders, some of which are fairly innocuous. But what is your take on the president's use of executive orders in this case?
I was very concerned when we learned that President Obama was going to be announcing a series of executive orders, because we have had presidents in the past that try to bypass the Congress because they know they're not going to get their proposals through our legislative branch, which is what they should do, and they just issue executive orders. And then what do you do about that? Congress then has to try to repeal or change what the president has done, and is that likely to go to the president's desk for signature? No, he issued the executive order to begin with. So any changes coming from the Congress are likely to be vetoed by the president. So it's a very tough dilemma. Looking over President Obama's executive orders that he signed recently last week on these gun control measures, I was relieved that he did not seem to try to do this lawmaking by executive order. In this instance, he had several innocuous things saying, I'm going to appoint the next director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and I wish Congress will confirm my nominee. Things like that. Now, looking at executive orders beyond this gun control debate, there's very little that we can do. We have to draw attention that it's an abuse of an executive power. They can be challenged in the courts. But there's very little you can do when the president says, I'm going to start a war in Libya. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. You can file a case and challenge it in court, but that'll take years. So it's a very disturbing type of an abuse by executives, and all we can do here in the short term is just draw attention to it and call him out as for the abuses that they are.
All right. John asks, rather than just supporting gun rights, a more effective response might be to support effective solutions, protection in schools, training teachers, mental health, legal process changes, etc. So getting experts essentially to propose solutions. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, when you talk to security experts about what can be done about these school shootings, what they will tell you is that once the horrific incident begins, it only comes to an end when somebody with a gun arrives on the scene. The police are going to get there as fast as they can. In the Sandy Hook incident, it took 20 minutes for the police officer to get there on the scene. That's 20 minutes where you have an armed maniac going around killing children. So what you want to do is reduce that time as much as possible. And so even though one of the things I try to do in this debate is bring the danger and risk back into some perspective, that these types of mass killings are highly publicized, but they're fairly rare events. So the NRA proposal about getting a police officer in every school, I tend to think that that's an overreaction to the danger. But if we want to talk about things that can be done, I think the schools that are looking at allowing teachers and principals that already are eligible for concealed carry permits to allow them to come into the school so that they can quickly react if somebody is in the school killing people, that's a step in the right direction. I think private schools should be able to set their own policies, but I think in jurisdictions like Utah, they're beginning to allow the teachers and principals that qualify to get the training, and if they want to keep a gun in the school for that risk, for that danger, they should be able to do so. I think that would be helpful.
Warren asks, and this is in light of the Heller decision and the follow-on, the McDonald decision in Chicago, he asks, given the Second Amendment, just how far can individual states go in restricting rights, the example being New York?
Right. Well, just for those people who are not aware, first of all, the Heller decision was the first landmark decision. It applied strictly to the District of Columbia because we knew that the Second Amendment applied as against the federal government. So it was brought here in the district to put the states and localities to one side. And the main issue was, does the right to keep and bear arms, does it apply, as some people have said for years, only for people involved in the National Guard and the militia, or do people have an individual right to keep and bear arms in their own homes for purposes of self-defense? The Supreme Court said, yes, it's an individual right. You don't have to be a member of the militia. but it was very limited. It said people could keep a handgun in the home for purposes of self-defense. The next big case that came along is called McDonald, and that involved the same type of case, except it was brought in the city of Chicago. And then the question became, does the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms apply beyond the federal government as against state and localities as well, like our other provisions in the Bill of Rights, like free speech, jury trial, and these types of things. And the Supreme Court came back again, another victory, and said, yes, this right applies as against state and localities as well. Now the debate is shifting to the types of regulations that are going to be permissible. And so we're going to be hearing cases about type of weaponry that's protected. We know handguns are, but what about other types of weapons? What about the types of people that can be prohibited from carrying arms? We know minors can be prohibited. Felons, it's been a long-standing prohibition that they do not have a right to keep and bear arms. They forfeited it because of past crimes. And then there are other time, place, and manner restrictions that are going to be in place. Justice Scalia made this clear in his Heller opinion to say just because there's a right to keep and bear arms, that doesn't mean that anybody can carry any gun under any circumstances. So these are what the courts are going to begin to wrestle with. I think you mentioned the New York regulations. You know, if we're trying to look, we're getting bombarded now with proposals. We've heard from New York. Down here in D.C., we've also heard from the governor of Maryland, who is proposing gun control restrictions as well. So we're beginning to take a close look at those proposals and to see which ones are going to be challenged in the courts. The New York have restricted the magazines, I think, to around 7 rounds. I think that is going to be challenged in court, and I think is very likely to be overturned in court. But it will take some time for that litigation to work its way.
Bernard says there seem to be 2 forks of the pro-gun control agenda. The rank and file seem to have a strong emotional component. Do legislators share this emotion, or are they pandering to it, or just using it to advance some undisclosed agenda?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think you find people with a variety of opinions on these things. You know, in the policy debate, we constantly hear on TV that you know, all they're proposing are common sense restrictions or reasonable regulations. But you have to remember, as I was just talking about with the Heller case in D.C. and the rules in Chicago, they went before the courts and they thought that these handgun prohibitions, they tried to persuade the justices that these were reasonable restrictions as well. So you have to take a look about what people consider to be reasonable or common sense. A lot of them think that a complete ban, you can't keep a handgun in your home, is a reasonable restriction, is a reasonable response to crime in the city. So that's one thing. They take some of these ideas pretty far. You're right that there's definitely that raw emotional reaction. I mean, it's just so horrible when you think about it. 6-year-old kids getting slaughtered in a school. It's just it's hard to, you know, it's unthinkable. So there is that raw emotional reaction. People want something done to have these tragedies averted. So are the politicians taking advantage of that, pandering to that? Some of them are. Some of them have, you know, a gun control agenda, which wasn't going anywhere a year ago, and now it is. So some of them fall into that category. But I think other people just see the tragedy and are looking around in good faith for what can be done about this. So it depends on who you're talking to.
It's worth noting what the rules were for possessing any kind of firearm in Washington, D.C. before the Heller decision. If I understand correctly, it couldn't be a handgun, or it had to be produced before 1976. It had to be disassembled. It had to be essentially useless in a crime
Yeah, there was a
situation.
complete ban on handguns. They said long guns were permissible for some, but they had to be disassembled and unloaded and locked away. So if your house is being broken into, you have to start assembling your weapon if you want to use it for self-defense. Now again, there was lots of people who were supporting that ban when it was initially challenged. President Obama, as I understand it, supported the D.C. laws. Now, a lot of these people started to change their tune after the Supreme Court declared them unconstitutional. Then we began to hear, well, I support the Heller decision, I support the Second Amendment, I support the individual right to keep and bear arms, but I think X, Y, and Z proposals are consistent with that. So we definitely do have to argue with and debate with people who have very strong views about the role of government and what they think people ought to be able to have. I think the gun control debate is a classic example of what Thomas Sowell called like a clash of visions. Some people think only the Army and only the police should have weapons, and the civilians should be totally disarmed. They think they really treat adults like children. They think they're just too clumsy to be able to defend themselves. They're too ill-tempered and are likely to kill people in a fit of anger. And this is one of the premises behind gun control laws.
Now, I'm recalling the Washington Post reporting in 2006 or so that D.C. police would be given AR-15s. And Kathy Lanyard, the D.C. police chief, saying, look, whatever it takes to keep our police officers safe as they're out in the field. And it seems like that argument is tossed aside when it comes to private ownership of those same guns.
I think that's right. I mean, the police have these semi-automatics with a certain magazine size, and the reason they are arming themselves is they may encounter criminals, and they think this is a good weapon to have when they deal with those criminals. Well, guess what? The rest of us have to deal with those criminals too. And again, the criminals always have the advantage because they get to decide when they're going to strike, and they take pains to choose a moment when the police are not around. So that leaves us by ourselves, and some of us want to be able to take some steps to enhance our own safety. And you know, with these police rules, it's interesting that in New York, this hasn't gotten enough publicity, but the governor, Cuomo, was in such a rush to put in his gun control proposals. There's usually a 3-day period to give the legislators a chance to read the legislation, and he said, no, we need this right away. So they were not given the customary 3 days. So what happens when they rush legislation in? It turns out that they forgot to exempt police officers in New York from these gun control restrictions, so that all the police officers who had semi-automatic handguns with a certain magazine size are in violation of the criminal law. So did Governor Cuomo come out and admit his mistake? No, he was out there taking credit for his big gun control package, but then they had a little press person come out 24 hours later to say there have been some mistakes, and those mistakes are not big, but they'll need to be corrected. Big embarrassment for Governor Cuomo that the media really are not taking him to task for.
Jeff asks, is there any good evidence on the effectiveness in reducing gun crimes associated with strict sentencing guidelines for crimes in which guns are used?
I don't know about a direct connection. I'm not aware of any study that has really focused in on that that aspect, the connection between that law and gun homicides. But that is the type of law that makes sense and you want to take a close look at, because it's not the number of guns, it's who has them. So you want policies that enable ordinary law-abiding people to have guns, and you want to try to do a few things to restrict access to the people that we know are going to be trouble. People who are felons, people who have criminal records, people who have a history of drug and alcohol abuse, where the police are constantly being called out to deal with those troublemakers. So giving an enhanced sentence to somebody who has a gun, who has a criminal record, keeping that person off the street, yes, that's likely to reduce crime by incapacitating that person and keeping him off the streets for a longer period of time.
Bob asks, if a state legislature determines that a 7-round magazine is protected by the Second Amendment, but an 8-round magazine is not, what is the basis for a judge to then make determinations as to what the constitutional cutoff might be, 9, 12, 20, or whatever?
Right. This is the type of issues that the courts are going to begin to wrestle with. What the Supreme Court said in Heller when it came to the type of weapons is the standard that they're going to look at is whether a dangerous or unusual weapon, a weapon that's not in common use, these are the types of weapons that are going to likely be restricted and then upheld by the courts as consistent with the Second Amendment. So when we're looking at weapons, and I think you mentioned the magazines, they're going to look at what's standard, what's common, and so that's why Dianne Feinstein's proposal of trying to keep magazines less than 10 is likely to fail that test. That will probably be challenged in the courts. We mentioned the New York law, I think, is under 10 or even under 7. That will be challenged, and I think they're likely to be invalidated. What is in common use right now with semi-automatic handguns, these are the standard firearm, sidearm of police officers. They tend to have an ammunition clip or magazine somewhere in the 11 to 19 range. So that's going to be kind of what the courts are going to be looking at there. That's going to be like standard factory issue. It's in common use. So that's the range for handguns. When we're talking about long guns, rifles, the standard AR-15 is the most popular rifle in the United States right now. The standard factory issue for that is a magazine going up to 30 rounds. So beyond that, that's where regulations are probably going to be more likely to be upheld. Less than those, more likely to be struck down.
Now, with respect to guns in common use, how relevant is it for a gun to be in normal, regular use by police? For example, you mentioned the AR-15. It's not only the most popular long gun in the world, but it's definitely the most popular long gun, I think, for police in their vehicles.
That's right. The AR-15 is the standard long gun backup weapon used by police. And that's something that the the court should look to, because, again, you have to put aside this rhetoric that we keep hearing on TV about hunting, about duck hunting, deer hunting. The police have these weapons, and the purpose they have for these weapons is not to go hunting. It's not for a gun collection where it's some hobby of theirs. They have these weapons to defend themselves and to defend other people in the community. So to have these types of weapons in private hands, this is what the courts are going to be looking to, and I think for that reason, as I said, the magazine clips that are standard factory issue now, that are commonly used by the police, they're going to be likely to be upheld in the courts.
Dave says the police response to these events seems to be ineffectual, if not downright peculiar. Instead of police charging into the area, they carefully, slowly sneak up on the perpetrator. Then we always see victims being led or chased out of the venue with their hands over their heads. We can't tell the difference between victims and perps. Who invented this bizarre response system, and can it be changed?
Right, that's a good question. The Columbine school shooting caused a big rethinking in police response to these incidents. When the police responded to the shooting at Columbine, they did not rush into the school. They did what police did in standard shootings around that time, which was they kind of drew a perimeter and they waited and waited before they went in. And as they began, security experts and police officials got together afterwards. Everybody concluded that that is totally unacceptable. The proper response to these types of mass shootings now is to get in there as fast as possible. These people who commit these mass shootings or school shootings, they're young men, they have mental problems, they're on a suicide mission, they're going to try to kill as many people as possible before they kill themselves. So the idea is to get in there as fast as possible, and when that happens, they either turn the gun on themselves or they lose the nerve. That, you know, they may have gone in thinking they're going to commit suicide, but they lose the nerve and surrender. And so everybody's pretty much agreed, there's a consensus now, that the proper response is to get a good guy with a gun in there as soon as possible. Now, the police response time, as I mentioned earlier, it might be 10, 20 minutes. So do you want to give this person that much time to kill people? No. You want to have other people available, either have security personnel at the school, or what would be less expensive and a more measured response, I think, in relation to the risk, is to allow the teachers or school administrators who are eligible for a concealed carry permit to keep a gun in the school so that they can reduce that time that the killer has to commit the atrocities he wants to do. I would also point out that another reason why we've come to these conclusions is that some of these shootings, incidents, have been stopped by civilians with guns. The thing is, you don't hear about them. The president doesn't want to talk about them, and the media doesn't want to talk about them either. You know, one of the reasons the media doesn't want to do it is it's not a mass shooting. It was brought to a conclusion very fast. Maybe only 2 people were killed. But it was an incident at the Appalachian Law School a few years ago where students ran from their classrooms when they knew there was a shooting. They ran to their cars, got their own guns, returned to the school, and confronted the killer. And it was brought to an end with only 2 or 3 people killed. And what happened was these students were interviewed. They gave dozens and dozens of interviews, and this is what's so odd, telling reporters what they had done. And when they looked to see how the stories were written up, the reporters would say something like, students were able to subdue the shooter, or they were able to bring it to an end, or stopped him. They left out the key details that they went and got their own guns, and with the guns they were able to put the shooting rampage to a stop. That's a clear example of media bias where they don't want to acknowledge that, you know, guns in private hands actually do a lot of good. And if we heard more of these stories, I think people would be even more against the gun control proposals that they already are.
Now, the Cato Institute has produced a report detailing these, many of these uses of the defensive use of guns to prevent or stop crimes in progress.
Exactly. We released a study last year. It's called Tough Targets. You can get that from the Cato website. And what we also did in order to draw more attention to these types of cases, we created an interactive map on the Cato website. It's called Guns and Self-Defense. So you can pull up that map, and to the extent to which these incidents are reported, we put them onto this map in order to draw more attention to the fact that people do use guns every day in order to save lives. And again, this is something that the media either doesn't want to report, or they report in a very misleading fashion, leaving out key details.
All right, H. Gastfriend asks, aren't background checks just de facto registration? And isn't that information available to officials should they desire to quote-unquote round them up?
Well, it depends. We have some states that try to do background checks, and the federal government has a background check system. The way in which the federal law was initially put into place was that you were supposed to have an instant check to see if you qualify for a gun, so like you don't have a criminal record, you were not, dishonorably discharged from the military, and they'll go through some other criteria that you're of sufficient age and that sort of thing. If you're eligible to purchase a weapon, so you pass the background check, you make the purchase, you leave the store, they were originally written so that those records, once the person has passed the check, those records were supposed to then be destroyed to allay fears of keeping records for purposes of, maybe one day using those records for confiscation. So under federal law, they were supposed to be destroyed. There's a controversy about whether or not that is actually being done. And then we have to look at the state and local regulations to see how they're written. I need to remind people that New York has come up before, but we're not just talking about President Obama and his proposals. In the wake of the shooting, we do have governors and state legislators around the country that are making their own proposals. So the fight is not strictly about federal law here in Washington. We have to look at what Governor Cuomo has done in New York. I mentioned Governor O'Malley here in Maryland has advanced some gun control proposals. So we have to look at what the states are doing as well.
A lot of states have gun rights protections that go beyond the Second Amendment. How do those protections offered at the state level confound or complicate federal efforts at regulating self-defense and gun rights?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that point, because this is another key aspect of the whole gun control debate and something you do not hear about on television. There has been such a revolution in gun gun policy and self-defense over the last 20 to 25 years. And what I'm talking about is the ability of people to get permits to carry handguns concealed in public. This is totally apart from the Second Amendment. A lot of states have passed what we call shall issue permits. So if you meet certain objective criteria, you're of sufficient age, no criminal record, no history of alcohol, drug abuse, this sort of thing. If you meet those objective criteria, then the government has to issue you a carry permit. What you don't hear about on the news is that over the past 15 years, we now have about 10 million Americans who have these carry permits. And this is something that we didn't have 20 years ago. And so you constantly are hearing like these people from the gun control side of the debate saying wherever there are guns, you're going to have more violence, more crime, more people shooting at one another over traffic disputes, being cut off in traffic, or fighting over parking spaces, or petty arguments. They're going to get into trouble. The blood will run in the streets. It'll be the OK Corral. We constantly hear those types of arguments. Here we've had this ongoing experiment over 10, 15 years, millions of people now with permits. Where's the violence? President Obama talks about research. It's like less than 1%, far less than 1% of permit holders have had their permits revoked because they've done anything wrong. So this is completely, the database to disprove the common argument that you hear on the other side is where people have access to weapons, or where there's going to be weapons, you're going to have more crime and more accidents. This totally disproves that. And this is happening apart from the Second Amendment. The states and localities have allowed people to have these carry permits. They're out there. And the criminologists are not debating how much crime has risen. They're debating among themselves to what extent has crime fallen in their jurisdictions. To what extent can we attribute that to this change that allows people to go around and be armed? Is it some people say it's responsible for a lot of the crime decline. Some people say it's only responsible for a little bit of it. But the key thing is the predictions that were made at the outset. They said crime was going to explode, murders were going to explode, and we're not talking about that. We're talking about the extent to which crime has declined in those jurisdictions.
And it's worth stressing just generally over this last 2 decades just how dramatic the decline has been in gun-related crime.
Right. Gun ownership is rising in the United States. The number of people who carry firearms in public, the number of permits that are being issued, all of these things have been climbing, and violent crime in the United States has been falling. So right there, it's disproving one of the main arguments of the gun control side.
Don asks a question here. If the premise of the Second Amendment is for citizens to guard themselves against government tyranny, how do gun control folks feel about the same government arming freedom fighters around the world in places like Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., with high-tech weaponry such as armed drones, shoulder-mounted rocket launchers, etc.?
Well, that's we're getting to foreign policy, and my knowledge base is beginning to fall off rapidly. But I would point out that one of our scholars, David Kopel, our associate policy analyst with the Deterrent Institute, who's doing a lot of media and writing for us on gun control issues, he's done a lot of work looking at what is going on in the UN, because there's a lot of gun control activity being done in the UN, people who are very much in favor of gun control and want civilian populations to be disarmed. And they have these gun disarmament treaties and conventions that they're constantly pushing there. So that's kind of what happened prior to this Sandy Hook incident, is that the people in the United States who are in favor of gun control, they know that they're unlikely to get their proposals through our Congress. The conventional wisdom, again, prior to this most recent incident in Sandy Hook, was that gun control is a political loser in the United States. It's unpopular. They can't get it done here. So they're beginning to look at alternative ways of getting their policies put in place. And so there's a lot of shenanigans going on in the UN that a lot of people aren't paying attention to. And so we would want to keep our eye on what's going on there with respect to what's happening in other countries around the world.
Question from Dale. How does one balance rights to privacy with gun rights when discussing limits to ownership with respect to those with mental illness? Who decides, and would there be some sort of federal registry?
Right. Again, when we're talking about these mass shootings, what we find is common among them is that they tend to be young men with some type of mental problem. Federal law already prohibits people who have been adjudicated with a mental problem from being able to purchase a firearm. What happened in the Sandy Hook situation was you had a young man who had not been adjudicated yet, but who was suffering from some type of problem, and he stole the weapon from his parents, and that's how he was able to get the gun. But federal law already prohibits somebody who's been adjudicated from being able to purchase a weapon. Now, again, we're trying to look at policies. Are there ways in which you can identify somebody and make them ineligible prior to being adjudicated with a mental illness? This raises a host of civil liberties problems. I think the line is pretty much drawn correctly where it is, but we're beginning to look at those types of proposals. We'll see what people want to put forward. But the problem is when you look at these shootings, it's only after the shooting that people say, well, that guy should have been locked up. But they are looking at it after the fact with 20/20 hindsight saying, this guy's a killer. But would you have been able to identify him before the shooting as somebody who was likely to commit a horrific crime? That's where the difficulty gets in. I've been doing a lot of reading on mental illness since this shooting happened, since it's definitely a part of the debate, but I don't know if the science is there yet to be able to tell us these people are likely to be violent and they need to be involuntarily committed now. I don't think the science is there, but we're all beginning to study those issues much more closely.
Tom asks, of all the proposed changes under consideration today, do you think any of them or any package of them would have prevented what happened at Sandy Hook?
I think the response has been going in the wrong direction. I think the media has been highly irresponsible in the way in which they cover these things. I do not think these shooters should be, their pictures and names should be on the cover of newspapers and magazines. I do not think the television stations should be putting their names and pictures all over the television. I think that's the wrong thing to do. I think you're encouraging copycats. And I think, so when we're talking about, when people ask me, all right, what do you think should be done? I mentioned earlier that schools should look at allowing teachers and principals who are, are eligible for concealed carry permits to be able to have them at the schools. I think the second thing the president could have done is put these horrific tragedies back into some perspective. He didn't do that. Instead of doing that, he turns the full attention of his administration and the Congress on what had happened in Connecticut. And our media has been just highly irresponsible, and I think in the way in which they cover these things. I think especially in the first 2 or 3 days, there's all of this asking of questions about why did this young man commit this crime? And they start going into his writings and his internet postings and splashing this all over the news. I think that's very irresponsible. So if I had my druthers, there would be a news blackout with respect to the shooter. I know when 20 children have been killed, they have to cover that. That's news. But do not give any attention at all to the shooter. Just don't use his name. Just refer to him as the deranged killer, and not give any attention to his political thoughts, or any of his delusional thinking and splashing that over the news. I think that encourages copycats, and we're likely to see, we really have to come to grips with the fact that another one of these things will happen. What can we do to reduce it? Don't give them the attention. and put them to a stop as quickly as possible. And I think it's also worth mentioning some of the things that we have been doing. That's right. In recent 10 years in school, there has been a renewed emphasis on stopping bullying. I think that is a useful thing, and so I think it's worthwhile to go back and say, well, what are some of the things that we're doing that is right? Certainly some of these young people who suffer from mental illness, they're going to be unfortunately maybe shunned by their fellow students, maybe bullied. So that's one useful thing that can be done as well.
All right, Dana asks, do you support the ban on machine guns? And if so, why support that but not other gun bans like AR-15s?
Yes, I'm glad this question came up as well, because there's so much talk. I don't like to use the term assault rifle because that's like a political term. We should just be talking about rifles, and the extent to which the media keeps repeating assault rifles, it just sows confusion among the public. The other thing the media does is that we'll be talking about rifles, but they'll be running film footage of somebody shooting a machine gun. So your average person who doesn't know the law, doesn't know anything about firearms, they're thinking, gosh, why are those things legal? But machine guns, where you just hold a trigger and the gun continues to discharge bullets, that's a machine gun. They're already severely restricted under the law. Only really collectors have them, or cartels have been stealing them from military sources. They're not in civilian use. So that's another way in which of drawing restrictions on the types of firearms that are going to be allowed and upheld under the courts. So they're already off the table, and we're talking about rifles now. And the AR-15, as we've mentioned, is one of the most popular rifles in the United States. It's one pull of the trigger, one bullet is discharged. And that's the type of firearm that we're talking about. And banning them would not, all it would do is take guns away from ordinary law-abiding people, and it's not going to have a big impact on crime. So I think that's a wrong-headed proposal.
Okay, this is going to be our last question. Kurt asks, what is rarely mentioned in the media is the deterrent effect of citizenry owning guns. A Japanese military official once said no one could invade America because there would be a person with a gun behind every clump of grass. How do we get that deterrent effect into the discussion? Of course, you already mentioned our report on the defensive use of handguns, but is it just shaming the media into making these concessions with regard to balancing the reporting, or is it something else?
We have to bring it up as much as possible. What we did with our study is that, first of all, people use guns in self-defense. We know that. Sometimes the criminal is shot and he's caught and apprehended. So we have those numbers. It's easy to count those. What's harder to count is where the gun is simply brandished and the criminal turns around and runs away. He's not apprehended, and the media tends not to report them because they don't have anybody in custody. Nobody's been shot. They don't have anything to report. And so those stories tend not to be reported. We did our study to try to draw attention to that, but I'm glad you brought up, because beyond those numbers, where guns were simply brandished, there's also the deterrent effect that you talked about. How many times has a criminal decided, I'm not going to attack him, I think he might be carrying a concealed weapon, or I'm not going to rob that house, I heard they have guns there. How many times has that happened? And that's a big part of this whole debate, is because it's easier for the media and the gun control crowd to point to the number of homicides and the number of suicides that happened every year. It's harder for them to count the number of lives that have been saved because a criminal decided, I'm not going to attack that person. I'm not going to commit a crime tonight. It looks like it's too risky. We know when they ask felons in prisons, do you try to find out whether the person is armed? And they always respond that a smart criminal will try to determine in advance whether a person is armed, whether they keep arms in the house. So we know it has a deterrent effect. It's just hard to measure, but we definitely have to bring it up into debates so that people can understand that having guns deters a lot of crime, stops a lot of mayhem in the United States every year, every month, every day.
Of course, it's always important to keep in mind that criminals are rational people.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much, Tim. These events are held each month, and we'll send you an email when the next one is scheduled. All of these events are archived on Cato's website. You can find older ones by clicking on the month tab at the top of this page. Thanks to Tim, Joe Kuhn, Evan Banks, Kevin Sennett, Jenna Hune, and Scott Morrison for helping us put this together. And, of course, a special thank you to you for your contributing to this discussion and for your ongoing support. Cato is 100% funded by private donations. We rely on folks like you to help us promote the important principles of individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and peace. And I hope with your continued support we can wage this battle of ideas. Talk to you next time.